Here is the complete long-form script, engineered to the precise structural, tonal, and pacing specifications of the calm drama story's framework, adopting the requested third-person perspective. Her name is Clara. She is 42 years old. Last Saturday evening, her father-in-law, a retired Navy admiral, humiliated her at a formal charitable gala by mocking her civilian status in front of 200 guests. Clara stood perfectly still, the icy condensation on her crystal water glass numbing her fingertips, knowing that in less than an hour, the entire room would see the classified sniper ink resting on her collarbone, and watch the Admiral's towering legacy quietly collapse. Before you hear what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story of quiet boundaries resonates with you. Drop your city and local time in the comments. We love knowing where our Life Shock Stories listeners are tuning in from. The Sterling family demanded a very specific kind of excellence. Admiral Thomas Sterling, a man who managed his civilian family with the same rigid, unyielding expectations he had once applied to a carrier strike group, valued two things above all else: impeccable public appearances and absolute obedience. His eldest son, Captain Mark Sterling, was the favored heir to this legacy. Mark wore his uniform like a shield, moving through the world with the loud, performative confidence of a man who had never been told no. Clara's husband, David, was the younger son. David had chosen architecture over the Naval Academy, a decision that had permanently relegated him to the margins of his father's respect. When Clara married David, she seamlessly inherited that same marginalized status. She was introduced at functions not by her name or profession, but simply as David's civilian wife. The hierarchy was never explicitly stated, it was demonstrated. During the family's annual Christmas dinner at the Sterling estate, the mahogany dining table was set with heavy silver and starched white linen. When it was time for the toast, Thomas raised his glass exclusively to Mark, praising his recent deployment and his promotion to captain. David sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the rim of his plate. When the meal concluded, Thomas did not ask the serving staff to clear the dishes. He looked directly at Clara, gesturing casually toward the empty gravy boat, and suggested she make herself useful in the kitchen. Clara gathered the porcelain plates, the warm ceramic burning slightly against her palms, and carried them away without a word. There was only one person in the Sterling family who saw the quiet indignities. Grandmother Eleanor Sterling, Thomas's own mother, lived in the sprawling east wing of the estate. Eleanor was 82, possessed a mind like a steel trap, and commanded the only authority Thomas still deferred to. She spent her afternoons in the sunroom, drinking black tea and watching the family dynamics unfold with sharp, discerning eyes. Eleanor never intervened loudly, but she made her allegiances known in small, undeniable ways. The pattern of casual dismissal wove itself into the fabric of the years. In the summer of 2018, during the family's 4th of July barbecue, Mark arrived with his new fiancée, a woman whose father sat on the Armed Services Committee. Thomas spent 3 hours giving them a personal tour of the grounds, leaving Clara and David to manage the grilling in the oppressive afternoon heat. When Clara offered Thomas a plate of food, he waved her away without making eye contact, stating he only ate with the officers. Clara felt the charcoal smoke stinging her eyes, but she simply set the plate down and returned to the fire. 2 years later, at David's architectural award ceremony in October 2020, the absence was even louder. David had designed a $45 million veteran rehabilitation center, securing a massive public grant. Clara had sent embossed invitations to the entire Sterling family. The evening of the ceremony, the auditorium was filled with city officials and medical directors. The 4 seats reserved for the Sterling family in the front row remained completely empty. The brass plaque in David's hands caught the stage lights, but his smile did not reach his eyes. Clara squeezed his hand, the wool of his suit jacket rough against her knuckles. Later that night, Thomas sent a text message stating that a golf tournament had run long. By Thanksgiving of 2022, the mistreatment had evolved into active exclusion. Thomas had arranged a private tour of a newly commissioned destroyer for the family. Clara arrived at the shipyard wearing a heavy wool coat against the biting wind, only to be stopped at the security checkpoint. Thomas had submitted the clearance forms for everyone except her. He turned back, his breath pluming in the freezing air, and loudly declared that the security parameters were too complex for a civilian to navigate. Clara stood on the asphalt, the cold seeping through her leather boots, and watched them walk up the gangway. If you have ever been made to feel small by a family member who uses their status as a weapon, you know exactly how heavy that silence feels. Tell us in the comments if you have ever had to bite your tongue to keep the peace. The breaking point arrived on November 14th, 2023, the night the first winter storm rattled the windows of the estate. It was a Tuesday. The Sterling family was finalizing the guest list for the annual Naval Heritage Foundation Gala, a $5,000 a plate charity dinner that Thomas chaired. Clara sat in the leather armchair in the study, listening to the grandfather clock tick away the seconds. Mark and his wife were assigned to the head table with a visiting 4-star general. When Clara asked what time she and David should arrive, Thomas stopped writing. He looked at her, his posture rigid. He stated, in front of Mark, David, and the event coordinator, that David would sit at the main table, but Clara would be placed at the overflow table near the kitchen doors. He reasoned that her lack of military pedigree would embarrass the family in front of the general. He said she simply lacked the discipline and bearing to sit among real veterans. Clara did not argue. She absorbed the quiet gasp from the event coordinator, nodded once, said she understood, and walked out of the study, her footsteps entirely silent on the thick Persian rug. She did not cry. Instead, she drove home, the windshield wipers battling the freezing rain, and walked into her own quiet study. She opened the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet and withdrew a heavy, fireproof lockbox. Inside lay a stack of redacted service records, a silver Navy cross, and a small, faded photograph of a covert sniper team in the mountains of Afghanistan. Clara had spent 8 years as a Tier 1 operator attached to an elite, deeply classified Joint Forces unit. She had left the service quietly, choosing a peaceful civilian life, and bound by non-disclosure agreements, she had never spoken of her deployments. Her husband knew she was a veteran, but even he did not know the full, lethal extent of her operational history. Clara spent the next 3 weeks preparing with methodical precision. She made a secure phone call to her former commanding officer, now working at the Pentagon. She requested a partial declassification of her final service citation, specifically the portion confirming her rank and specialized operational status. She paid $2,500 to a constitutional lawyer to ensure the release of the documents violated no active security protocols. Then, she visited grandmother Eleanor in the sunroom. The older woman poured a cup of black tea, listened to Clara's quiet explanation, and smiled a slow, knowing smile. Eleanor handed Clara a pristine, notarized envelope containing the original founding charter of the Naval Heritage Foundation, a document that proved Eleanor, not Thomas, held the ultimate authority over the charity's board. There was a moment of hesitation on the Wednesday before the gala. Clara sat on the edge of her bed at 2 in the morning, the house silent, holding the silver medal in her hands. She wondered if exposing the truth would irreparably damage David's fragile relationship with his father. But as she traced the cold metal with her thumb, she realized that protecting a man who openly disrespected her was not peace, It was merely surrender. What do you think happened next? Did Clara make the right choice to finally step out of the shadows? Let us know your thoughts below. The evening of the gala. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was draped in dark blue velvet and gold accents. 300 guests, including senators, defense contractors, and high-ranking officers, filled the room with the low hum of influential conversation. Clara wore a deep emerald evening gown. The neckline was elegant, sweeping just low enough to leave her collarbones visible. On her right collarbone rested a small, dark, intricate tattoo, a highly specific insignia known only to elite joint forces operators, a mark that could not be bought, only earned through classified combat. Thomas took the podium at 8 o'clock. The clinking of silverware ceased. He delivered a booming speech about duty, sacrifice, and the superiority of the military bloodline. He gestured to Mark, who stood and received a round of applause. Then, inexplicably, Thomas deviated from his script. Seeking a cheap laugh, he looked toward the overflow table, where Clara sat. He joked into the microphone that some families were built on iron, while others were deluded by civilians who couldn't comprehend the weight of service. He looked directly at Clara, laughed, and asked over the sound system for her to tell the room what rank she held in the civilian world. Clara stood up. The fabric of her dress rustled softly in the sudden, heavy silence. She walked calmly toward the front of the room. She did not raise her voice. She reached the head table and handed a thick, cream-colored folder to General Vance, the 4-star guest of honor sitting next to Thomas. As she leaned forward, the chandelier light caught the dark ink on her collarbone. General Vance stopped breathing. He recognized the insignia immediately. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, and offered Clara a sharp, textbook-perfect salute. The entire room froze. Thomas stared at the general, then at Clara, his face draining of all color. Clara turned to Thomas. Her voice was level, echoing cleanly through the silent ballroom. She stated that she had retired as a Chief Warrant Officer 4 after completing 5 classified combat deployments. She explained that she had remained quiet to protect the integrity of her unit, not because she lacked bearing. Then, she gently placed Grandmother Eleanor's notarized envelope on the podium. She informed Thomas that the true founder of the charity was terminating his position as chairman, effective immediately, due to conduct unbecoming of the foundation's values. A murmur swept through the 300 guests. Thomas's hands began to tremble visibly, gripping the edges of the wooden podium. Nobody clapped. Several investors at the front tables quietly stood up and walked toward the exit. Over the following 3 months, the natural consequences of Thomas's public humiliation dismantled his carefully curated life. The foundation board formally voted to remove him, citing a loss of confidence from major donors. General Vance quietly ensured that Mark's pending promotion to major was placed on an indefinite administrative hold, noting that arrogance was a liability in command. Thomas's consulting contracts with defense firms dried up overnight. Nobody wanted to associate with an officer who had publicly humiliated a decorated Tier 1 veteran. Clara did not post on social media. She did not give interviews to the military press. She simply went to work, tended her garden, and let the silence do its work. On a crisp Sunday afternoon in late spring, the dining table in Clara and David's modest, sunlit home was set with mismatched ceramic plates. The smell of roasting rosemary chicken filled the kitchen. Grandmother Eleanor sat at the head of the table, laughing warmly as David poured her a glass of iced tea. The heavy silver and rigid rules of the Sterling estate were entirely absent. Thomas and Mark were not invited. Their absence hung in the air not as a loss, but as a profound, settling peace. Clara looked around the table, the afternoon sunlight catching the edge of her collarbone, and smiled. If you are listening to this and you recognize yourself in this story, know that you are allowed to walk away from tables where you are not respected. You are allowed to keep your accomplishments quiet until the moment they are needed. You are allowed to let the natural consequences of someone's arrogance fall squarely on their own shoulders. Respect does not require a uniform, and family is not determined by an inheritance. Apologies expire. Boundaries do not. If this story brought you a sense of peace, please share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of quiet vindication.